He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even stand. But in that one moment, he brought an empire of arrogance to its knees. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped into Lancaster Bistro, the kind of restaurant where everything felt curated light, silence, scent. The maitre d' looked up and greeted him politely, though without recognition. That was fine. He wasn't dressed for attention. Black utility jacket, dark jeans, scuffed boots. Clean-shaven, but older now. Older in a way no gym could smooth out. He'd asked for the table near the window. Not because it had the best view, although it did, but because someone else used to sit there. And Arnold wasn't sure if this was grief or ritual or something closer to guilt. The hostess led him across the polished floor, past white linen tables and diners murmuring over wine and salmon. His footsteps were measured, quiet. He nodded when she motioned to the corner seat. "This okay?" she asked. He gave a small nod. "It's fine." She offered the lunch menu and stepped away. Arnold didn't open it. He'd already decided. Grilled chicken, greens, and water. No starch. No wine. He placed his folded coat on the back of the chair and sat down slowly. One hand brushed across the edge of the table, as if checking if the memory still lingered there. Outside the window, Los Angeles was pretending it was in a hurry. People talked into phones, stared through traffic, pointed at taxis that wouldn't stop. Inside, the noise softened. There was jazz playing faintly from somewhere, a real piano. Maybe, or just a well-recorded track. It didn't matter. It was background, like everything else today. Arnold reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He placed it on the table, face down, just for a second, then turned it over. 3 men in military uniforms, smiling. One of them was him. One of them was gone. He stared at the photo longer than he meant to. A waitress approached gently. "Can I get you started with a drink?" He looked up. Her eyes were kind. She didn't know who he was, or maybe she did and just didn't say it. Either way, he appreciated that. "Just water," he said, "and grilled chicken, no sauce, no sides." She nodded and walked off, and he sat back again, fingers interlaced, elbows off the table. He didn't come here often, just once a year. On this day, same table, same seat, same silence. A man outside the glass pounded on the hood of a car and shouted something angry. Arnold didn't flinch. He breathed in slowly, held it, let it go. Maybe today would pass like the others. Maybe it wouldn't. He hadn't come to start anything. But sometimes trouble didn't wait for permission. Sometimes it just walked through the door. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The door swung open harder than it needed to. It didn't slam exactly, but it broke the rhythm. The chime overhead, the quiet clink of cutlery, the soft piano drifting through speakers, all of it paused for just a second, just enough to notice. The man who entered wore a uniform. LAPD. The blue looked too crisp. The belt, too tight. His walk heavy, like he needed people to hear it. Every step on the marble echoed louder than it should have. Arnold looked up briefly, not from fear, instinct. His eyes tracked the man's reflection in the window glass, not the man himself. Years of reading tension in silhouettes never really went away. The officer, Ryan Blake, as the nameplate would later confirm, swept his gaze across the room like a searchlight, his jaw clenched and unclenched. Not angry yet, just looking for a reason to be. He had that kind of authority that didn't invite respect, only avoidance. A waitress near the counter dropped a teaspoon. It clattered against the tile, small but sharp. She muttered an apology, though to no one in particular. Blake didn't even glance her way. His eyes locked onto the corner table, Arnold's table, and something changed in his posture. It was subtle, a tightening around the shoulders, a recalibration, like a man preparing to correct a mistake that, in his mind, someone else had made. He walked straight toward Arnold, not toward the bar, or the empty booths, or the back section. Just him, a line drawn without words. Arnold saw the approach. He didn't move. His hands stayed folded on the table, elbows still in the air. Calm, but alert in a way most people wouldn't notice. Blake stopped at the edge of the table, just close enough to cast a shadow across Arnold's meal that hadn't arrived yet. "You're in my seat," he said. His voice was clipped, official, laced with something sourer than authority, entitlement, maybe, or ownership. Arnold looked up slowly. He studied the man for half a beat longer than necessary. "Then I was seated here by the staff." Blake didn't blink. "I sit here every week, Thursdays. That seat's mine." Arnold's eyes dropped to the badge, then rose back up. It didn't have your name on it. Around them, the air thickened, no raised voices, no threats, but the shift was undeniable. A couple nearby lowered their eyes. One man looked at his phone not to scroll, but to quietly start filming. Blake took half a step closer. "You gonna move?" Arnold tilted his head, not defiant, just direct. "Is this official police business?" Blake's nostrils flared. "It can be." Arnold didn't answer. The waitress returned at the worst moment, holding his water in a small plate of bread he hadn't asked for. She hesitated, unsure where to stand. Blake didn't move to make room. He just stared down at Arnold like the uniform gave him permission. And Arnold, without shifting a muscle, simply said, "I think you've confused your badge with your name." The glass of water trembled in the waitress's hand. And still, Arnold hadn't touched his food, or stood, or blinked first. Blake didn't like that answer. His lips curled slightly, just enough to suggest he'd heard far worse, but not often from someone who didn't immediately apologize afterward. He looked Arnold over, scanning him like a checklist: the boots, the age, the body that still held weight like stone, the calm that didn't match the setting. Then he smirked. It wasn't a smile. It was a warning dressed in casual cruelty. "You know who I am?" Blake asked, tilting his head, voice low but firm. Arnold didn't respond, not because he didn't hear, but because the question didn't deserve an answer. Blake leaned one elbow on the table, uninvited. The silverware rattled faintly from the pressure. "I don't think you do, because if you did, you'd already be halfway out the door." Arnold finally looked at him, really looked. Then, calmly, "Are you always this desperate to be seen?" The smirk twitched, faltered for a second. Not broken, just chipped. A couple nearby had stopped pretending to eat. A man in a suit turned slightly, phone angled just low enough to keep filming without looking obvious. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Blake said. Arnold's voice didn't rise. "I think I just did." The waitress was still standing awkwardly to the side, clutching the tray with one glass of water and a single slice of bread. Her eyes kept darting between the two men, unsure if she should intervene or disappear. Blake turned toward her with mock sweetness. "Is there a manager? Maybe someone who can explain this man's confusion?" The girl opened her mouth, then closed it. She wasn't trained for this. "No one is." Arnold spoke. Not to Blake this time, but to her. "It's okay. I'll wait for the food." His tone was warm, oddly gentle, and that made it worse, because Blake wanted tension. He wanted a scene, and Arnold kept refusing to play. "I said this is my seat," Blake snapped. "I sit here every week. This is where I eat." Arnold nodded once, almost sympathetically. "That sounds lonely." The insult landed softer than a slap, but deeper. Blake stood straight again, nostrils flaring. "This isn't over," he said. "It never started," Arnold replied, eyes steady. Blake stepped back, but didn't walk away. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a business card, the kind that pretends to be formal, but really just screams importance. He tossed it on the table. It landed face up: Ryan Blake, Officer, Los Angeles Police Department. Arnold didn't pick it up, just glanced at it, then pushed it aside with one finger, as if it had dirt on it. "You can have the table when I'm finished." he said, not a second sooner. Blake stared at him, veins starting to rise in his neck. But Arnold, he just reached for the water. Calm, measured. The glass didn't shake in his hand. Blake didn't leave. He stepped to the side instead, hovering like a threat that hadn't been spoken yet, but was already understood. The waitress set the water down, finally, then vanished so fast it was like she'd never been there at all. Arnold took a slow sip, not because he was thirsty, but because silence needed something to lean on. He placed the glass back down, carefully, as though every movement had weight now. Across the restaurant, sound had thinned. The jazz still played, but it felt distant, like it belonged in another room, a safer one. Blake crossed his arms. His knuckles whitened just slightly, betraying what his face still tried to hold together. "You think this is strength?" he asked, voice sharper now, more public. Arnold didn't answer. Blake's gaze darted around the room. A couple of phones were now openly pointed in their direction. Not hidden anymore. Not subtle. This guy bothering anyone he called out, louder than necessary, or just me. No one responded. Blake chuckled dryly. Right. That's what I thought. Then, without warning, he reached across the table and flipped Arnold's photo over. The small, worn picture, 3 soldiers frozen in time, now faced the ceiling. His finger tapped it once, deliberately. "Friends of yours," Arnold's hand moved, gently placing itself over the photograph, covering it like a father shielding a candle from the wind. "Be careful what you touch," he said. The voice was low, not threatening, not quite, but something shifted. Blake leaned in, his shadow swallowing the table again. "I don't care who you were," he hissed. "You're nobody now. Just an old man playing dress-up in someone else's world." Arnold looked at him, and for the first time, something flickered. Not rage, not even pain. Memory. He said nothing for a long beat. "Then that's the second time someone said that to me. The first time." He didn't walk away proud. Blake stiffened. His hand drifted closer to his belt. Not to his radio. Not to his badge. Lower. Arnold noticed. Everyone did. The room wasn't quiet now because it was peaceful. It was quiet like the moment right before a fuse burns down. A woman whispered something behind her menu. A fork clinked softly to the floor. One of the busboys peeked around the corner of the bar, then ducked back. Arnold's fingers traced the edge of the photo once more before slipping it into his jacket pocket. He looked up at Blake slowly, calmly, and said, "If you're trying to provoke me, you're wasting your time." Blake's hand hovered near the holster, just a few inches. Not enough to be criminal, but enough to be a threat, a statement. Arnold didn't move, not even to blink. The badge, the table, the uniform, all of it was noise, and he'd learned a long time ago. The strongest answer is the one that doesn't flinch. The silence fractured. It didn't happen all at once. No scream, no glass shattering, but in 100 smaller ways. The jazz music cut off mid-bar, the pianist freezing with both hands above the keys. A baby somewhere in the back started to cry, as if sensing something the adults hadn't yet admitted. And then Blake's hand moved. Fast. Faster than most would expect from a man built like that. His palm slammed down to his side, fingers curling tight around the grip of his service weapon. In one motion, smooth and brutal, he drew the gun and pointed it straight at Arnold's chest. Gasps rippled across the restaurant like shrapnel. Someone yelled. Chairs scraped hard against tile. A wine glass fell, exploded against the floor near the bar. People ducked. Others froze. Phones didn't. Half a dozen were pointed now, filming, trembling hands and wide eyes, documenting the stillness at the center of the chaos. Arnold didn't move. He didn't raise his hands, didn't lean back, didn't even look at the weapon, just stared straight into Blake's eyes, as if the barrel wasn't there at all. "Get up!" Blake barked, his voice cracking not from volume, but strain. Arnold said nothing. His hand remained flat on the table, close to his water glass, though he made no move toward it. Now, Blake snarled. Still, Arnold stayed still. In his pocket, he could feel the folded photograph. It pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. And for a moment, barely long enough to see his eyes glazed, just a little, he wasn't here. He was in a tent overseas, 20 years younger, kneeling beside a man who wouldn't stop bleeding, the friend who sat at this table once, the man the system forgot. The reason he came today. Arnold inhaled slowly. Is this really who you are, he asked, voice soft, almost tired. All that training, all that authority. For this, Blake's hand trembled, only slightly, but enough. A line of sweat trailed down his temple. His face was red now, the kind of red that comes when anger mixes with realization and doesn't know which will win. You don't tell me what I am, he snapped. Arnold's eyes never left his. I don't have to, he said. You just did. Somewhere in the back, a manager was calling 911. Someone else was sobbing quietly. And still, the gun remained aimed. Last chance. Blake growled. Get up. Arnold reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately. Several people screamed, but all he pulled out was a phone. No unlocking, no calling, just a tap. A single press of a preset button, a quiet emergency. Then he set the phone down, face down, next to the water glass. His eyes locked back onto Blake. I'm not moving, he said. And this is going to follow you longer than that badge ever did. Blake didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing hard, the gun shaking now, and everyone watching. The phone on the table didn't make a sound. It didn't flash, didn't buzz, didn't light up. But somewhere beyond the windows, somewhere past the traffic and the palms swaying and hot wind wheels were already turning. Arnold didn't look at the device. He didn't need to. The tap was enough. The encrypted alert, tied to a small network of people who owed him nothing. Except for one man. One man who still remembered the difference between power and service. Chief Samuel Harper. Outside, in the distance, faint sirens began to rise. But inside the restaurant, the tension didn't lift. It tightened. Blake still had the gun raised, his eyes darting not just at Arnold anymore, but toward the filming phones, the edge of the room, the manager whispering into a headset near the bar. He was losing control, and worse, he could feel it slipping. That's when people make mistakes. Not in rage and fear of being watched while they lose it. Arnold slowly leaned back in his chair. Not a show of ease, but of certainty. He'd spent most of his life training his body to resist tension. Right now, he was using everything he had not to let that grief boil up and spill over. But it did leak just a little through memory, through a name. Tommy, his best friend, former partner in the military. The man who used to sit at this very table, laugh too loud, cut his steak with the wrong side of the knife. The one who called Arnold governor even after he stopped being one. The one who believed in systems until the system crushed him, until he filed a report on a fellow officer and found himself isolated, ignored, and then gone. It wasn't suicide, not exactly. It was something slower, lonelier. This seat hadn't been empty today. It had been haunted. And the man pointing a gun across the table, he was just a newer version of the same virus. You're not afraid, are you? Blake muttered. The words were smaller now. Defensive. Arnold's response was quiet. No. Blake's eyes narrowed. You should be. Another pause. This one stretched long. Arnold looked down, not at the gun, but at his phone still silent. He lifted it briefly, flipped it once in his palm, then placed it back down. Calm, like someone folding a flag at a funeral. The doors behind them didn't open yet, but the sound outside had changed. The sirens were louder, closer. Arnold looked back up. You have about 60 seconds, he said, voice level, to decide what kind of man you want to be when they walk in. Blake flinched. His hand didn't lower, but his knuckles were white now, the gun not trembling exactly but no longer confident in its grip. Outside, the glass red and blue lights started to scatter across the white tablecloths like bruises blooming in daylight. And inside the room, no one spoke, because everyone knew the moment was about to break. The sirens were no longer distant. They were right outside now, bouncing off glass, folding around steel and concrete, washing the walls of Lancaster Bistro in pulses of red and blue. The light reached in like judgment, sliding across faces, glinting off forks, catching on the edge of Arnold's water glass. But inside, Blake's gun still hovered. Shaky now, uncertain. The silence in the room had become unbearable, the kind that made you feel like breathing too loud might set something off. Every phone was raised. Every eye was fixed. No one knew if they were watching a tragedy or a reckoning, or both. And then the restaurant sound system, normally playing soft jazz, now dead for minutes, crackled to life. A voice, measured, calm, heavy with authority earned, not borrowed. "Officer Ryan Blake, this is Chief Samuel Harper. Stand down. You are surrounded." The words landed like a hammer. Blake twitched, his neck jerking slightly toward the ceiling speaker, like he hadn't expected it to come from there. His eyes darted to the front entrance where silhouettes of armed officers now gathered in formation, visible through the frosted glass. His grip on the gun faltered, slightly, but enough. Arnold remained seated, eyes on Blake. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just waited, like a man who's seen this collapse before. "This is not a request. Officer Blake," Harper's voice came again, firmer now. "Put the weapon down. Step away from the table. Now." Blake looked around, slowly, at the faces, the phones, the stillness. He saw himself reflected in all of it, outlined by his own posture, his own decisions. What had once felt like control now felt like exposure. He stared back at Arnold. "You planned this," Blake hissed, but it didn't land. It didn't sound accusatory, just hollow. Arnold didn't answer. Blake's hand began to tremble more noticeably now. The weight of the gun, the weight of the room, it was all pressing back. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. Arnold finally spoke, quietly. "No. You were trying to remind someone they didn't belong." A pause. "Then, but I wasn't the one who needed reminding." Blake's jaw clenched, like he wanted to shout, or cry, or maybe just vanish. But instead, he lowered the gun, slowly, inch by inch, as if resisting gravity itself. He placed it on the table, not gently, not violently, just heavily, like he was surrendering something more than a weapon. The room exhaled, but no one moved yet. The tension hadn't broken, it had only shifted. Arnold didn't flinch. He simply sat back, his posture unchanged, eyes steady on the man unraveling in front of him. The front doors opened. Chief Harper walked in alone at first, no weapon drawn, his face unreadable, carved in resolve. He didn't look at Arnold, not yet. He looked at Blake. "Step away from the table," Harper said, "and hand me your badge." And that was when Blake's shoulders dropped, because he knew this was the moment that would follow him longer than his name ever did. Blake didn't move right away. His hand hovered over his chest, fingers brushing the badge clipped to his uniform. You could see the hesitation, not pride, not righteousness, just the slow, awful realization of what it meant to let go. To lose not just a job, but the illusion that came with it. Across the room, not a soul stirred. Harper remained still, one hand outstretched steady, not forceful, the other at his side. His voice hadn't risen once. It didn't need to. "Now," Harper said. No anger, just gravity. Blake unclipped the badge. His fingers fumbled. It took 2 tries, and when it came free, he held it for a moment longer than necessary. His jaw clenched. His mouth moved slightly, words forming but not spoken. Then, without ceremony, he dropped it onto the table in front of Arnold. It landed with a dull clack, not loud, but final. The kind of sound that doesn't echo in the air, only in the memory. Arnold didn't look at the badge. He looked at Blake, and for the first time, his expression shifted just slightly. Not satisfaction, not pity, something colder. The quiet disappointment of a man who's seen this before, who's watched men confuse authority for worth and mistake fear for respect. Harper stepped forward, gently pushed the gun farther down the table with 2 fingers, then took the badge and pocketed it without ceremony. "Escort him out," Harper said. 2 officers entered behind him, younger, alert. No show of power, just precision. They moved to either side of Blake, who didn't resist. His legs worked, but his spine didn't. He looked smaller now, shorter, somehow. Even the belt sagged like the weight of the moment had changed how it sat on him. As they turned toward the door, Blake looked back at Arnold. Something flickered across his face, anger. Sure, but deeper than that, confusion. Loss. The quiet, devastating understanding that the world would remember this moment differently than he had lived it. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe a curse, maybe an apology, but nothing came out, just a breath that failed to find shape. Then the doors opened again, and Blake disappeared into the flashing light outside. The restaurant didn't cheer. There was no applause, only the soft clatter of utensils being placed back on plates, the murmur of people returning to themselves. A woman cried quietly. A man across the room finally stopped recording and stared at his screen, like he didn't quite believe what he'd captured. Arnold remained seated. The waitress returned slowly, as if unsure it was truly over. Her eyes flicked to the badge-shaped shadow on the tablecloth. Then to him. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Arnold nodded once. "I'm fine." She hesitated. "I didn't know what to do." He looked up at her, not with authority, not with wisdom, just weariness. "You stayed," he said. "That's more than most." She blinked, then stepped back, a little steadier. Arnold reached for his water, took a sip, and let the weight of everything settle in silence. Outside, the lights were fading, but inside something had shifted and would not be returning to what it was. The footage hit the internet before the sirens stopped echoing. By nightfall, it had already gone viral. A dozen shaky angles, the trembling gun, Arnold's silence, the badge clattering onto linen. Every second stitched together by strangers with phones and too much adrenaline. No commentary needed. The video spoke for itself. Retired Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger holds ground against armed cop. LAPD officer draws gun over table dispute. No words, a no fear, no backing down. Arnold didn't watch any of it. He was back in his apartment that evening, lights low, a cup of tea cooling on the counter. The TV was off. His phone kept buzzing, but he let it ring. Politicians, journalists, producers each trying to pull something from the moment. A quote, a take, a soundbite. But Arnold had already said everything he needed to, by not saying much at all. And besides, this wasn't a story for headlines. Not really. It was a story about what happens after. A week later, Blake was indicted. Charges included reckless endangerment, unlawful brandishing of a firearm, and abuse of power. The evidence was overwhelming. No one tried to spin it. In court, he looked even smaller than he had leaving the restaurant. Civilian clothes didn't offer him the illusion of rank anymore. The badge was gone. The tone was gone. Just a man, alone, facing the system he thought would always protect him. Arnold sat in the back of the courtroom, unannounced, no fanfare. He didn't need a front row seat to watch the fall. The prosecutor played the footage, over and over. At one point, they paused on the moment Arnold tapped his phone, zoomed in, a calm, lawful call for help. The prosecutor said, not violence, not defiance, just clarity. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. The sentence, 5 years. Barred from future law enforcement work, stripped of pension, A lifetime of shadow in exchange for one moment of arrogance. Still, Arnold didn't smile. After the hearing, a young officer approached him outside the courthouse. She was maybe 25. Nervous hands. Badge too new to carry weight yet? Sir, she said, my dad. He used to talk about you. From your movies. I mean, he said you always knew the difference between action and violence. Arnold gave a small nod. Polite. Then she added, I think I want to be that kind of officer. For the first time all day. Something in Arnold's expression softened. Then be better than me, he said. Start quieter. Stay longer. She didn't quite understand, but nodded anyway. Later that evening, back home, Arnold sat alone in the same chair he always used. Same cup of tea, now warm again. On the table, the photo of Tommy. The same old crease down the middle. He didn't frame it, didn't hide it, just kept it close. Because sometimes the only victory worth having is remembering the one you couldn't save. A year passed. The city didn't stop. It never does. New scandals, new names, new outrage to replace the last. But some things didn't fade, not completely. Lancaster Bistro still kept the table. They never marked it, never named it. But no one sat there. Not once in 12 months. Regulars avoided it like a shrine. Newcomers were gently steered elsewhere. It became the kind of space that didn't need a sign, just silence and memory. And on the same day, 1 year later, he returned. Arnold stepped through the doors just after noon. Same boots, same jacket, hair shorter now, grayer, his face a little more weathered, his walk slower, perhaps, but no less deliberate. The same hostess wasn't there, but a younger one recognized him from somewhere she couldn't quite place. She opened her mouth to ask, then saw the look in his eyes and decided not to. He nodded toward the corner. She just smiled and stepped aside. The table looked smaller than he remembered. He sat down without ceremony, slid his coat over the back of the chair, placed a folded photo on the table. Still worn, still creased, still Tommy. No speech, no camera, no attention. The same jazz track hummed softly through the speakers. He ordered the usual grilled chicken, greens, no sauce. As he waited, someone approached from the side, a young man, early 20s, nervous but not awkward, shirt tucked in like he cared about being taken seriously. Arnold looked up. It was the busboy from a year ago, the one who'd watched everything from the corner. Only now, he wasn't carrying a tray. He wore a badge, a real one, just pinned, still shining. I don't mean to interrupt, the young man said. Arnold didn't wave him off. I just wanted to say, I was here, that day. Arnold nodded slowly. The man hesitated. I signed up a week after, not because of what you did, but because of how you didn't do anything. Arnold raised an eyebrow, not confusion, just curiosity. You didn't fight, you didn't yell, you just sat, and it made him crumble. A beat. Then the young man added, that's the kind of strength I want to wear this badge with. Arnold studied him a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, faintly metallic, an old unit coin, military issue, scarred on the edges. He slid it across the table. The young officer looked down, picked it up like it might shatter in his palm. No one ever gave me one of these, he said. Arnold replied, that's because you're supposed to earn it later. They didn't shake hands, didn't need to. The officer walked away, posture a little straighter. Arnold sat back, looked at the photo, and then, quietly, at the empty seat across from him. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, the table remained a place where one man never stood, and everything still changed. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.